Why are you even here? You don't do anything. You won't help me. You won't even hold me. When we fall in love, we want our partner to understand us and connect with us. We do this through communication. This communication can be verbal affirmation, physical touch, giving gifts, spending quality time with them, or even providing acts of service. These methods of communicating love are commonly referred to as love languages and are the most common ways in which lovers express their affection for their partner. However, what happens when two people who are incapable of expressing affection fall in love with each other? How can two people who can't even comprehend love languages show their love for each other? Can what they have together even be called love? These questions come to mind when we examine the relationship between Shinji and Asuka from Neon Genesis Evangelion. Shinji and Asuka's relationship in Evangelion and its sequel films can be summed up in one word: complicated. Evangelion does a great job of showing us that just because two people have romantic attraction for each other doesn't mean that they should end up together. Like everything else in the Evangelion franchise, the romance between these two broken and mentally unstable children has many different layers to it. We can see throughout Neon Genesis Evangelion that Shinji has romantic feelings for Asuka and that Asuka definitely reciprocates these feelings. However, the way that Evangelion chooses to display these romantic feelings are controversial, to say the least. Neither Shinji nor Asuka have the emotional capacity to properly communicate their feelings for each other. Thus, their relationship across the entire franchise is defined by animosity, jealousy, rage, and lots of miscommunication. Neon Genesis Evangelion has always been about the innate human experience of internal suffering and the difficulties of making connection because of that suffering. Despite the bombastic giant robots and kaiju battles, the story's core is about the constant despair that Shinji Ikari endures as he struggles to determine why he deserves to exist. Shinji doesn't want to exist. This complicated set of emotions stems from the loss of his mother, the consequences that had on his father, and his own inability to understand himself or others. He always feels like a burden, so he constantly seeks reassurance from others to validate his own existence. This is why being an Eva pilot ignited a sense of passion within him and made him want to continue living, at least to continue piloting an Eva. The praise that he received for being a pilot from the likes of Misato and especially from his father gave him a reason to live. This external validation replaced any need for personal introspection or self-acceptance. Since Shinji hated himself so much, the only thing that kept him going was knowing that he could be useful to somebody else. As long as he could do things to make other people happy, he could temporarily forget about how much he hates himself. It's like Shinji is atoning for a lifetime of sins he never committed by being everyone's doormat. This ultimate people-pleaser mentality puts him in stark contrast to his love interest, Asuka Langely Soryu. Asuka is also the result of an incredibly brutal upbringing, with her mother mentally breaking down and replacing her with a doll while her father abandoned them. The most twisted part of her upbringing was when her mother decided to test out some new rope and decided to take the doll with her instead of Asuka herself. She develops this brazen, aggressive, and very loud personality that she uses as a coping mechanism to hide her very deep insecurity. Much like Shinji, she craves the validation that comes with being an Eva pilot. To her, being a pilot, specifically being the best pilot, means that she has a reason to exist and deserves to continue existing. If she isn't the best or the only thing in someone's life, then she might as well have been replaced with a doll. Shinji and Asuka are both incapable of communicating their wants and desires for each other. Unfortunately, Shinji is too passive to express his desires in any meaningful way, and Asuka is too proud to show any form of vulnerability. Their relationship goes beyond your basic tsundere trope where the girl pretends to hate the guy but secretly loves him. If Asuka were to ever admit that she wants Shinji to love her, she would open herself up to vulnerability, and once again she would have to risk being replaced. From her perspective, the only way that she wants Shinji is if he takes it upon himself to unequivocally choose her and only her. Not Rei, not Misato, just her. This explains all of her aggressive attempts at flirting with Shinji, as well as their adorably awkward lip battle in episode 15. However, Shinji's baggage prevents him from doing anything without expressed orders. Shinji wants to be with Asuka, but asking her directly would go against his self-loathing that has long since consumed his soul. He needs Asuka to order him to love her, but Asuka needs him to take that first step. Neither of them are capable of communicating this to the other, and both believe that the other hates them when the exact opposite is true. It's important to point out that both Shinji and Asuka are around 14 years old, so if we combine all of the mental turmoil that these two go through with the confusing and chaotic effects of puberty, we've got ourselves a recipe for an extremely toxic relationship. And the relationship only gets more toxic as we get closer to the end of Evangelion. The end of Evangelion film can be seen as the logical conclusion to Shinji and Asuka's poor communication. Shinji, unable to cope with the extreme sense of loneliness and agony that he feels, is looking for some form of comfort in the girl that he wants to love. However, Evangelion isn't known for being normal. Instead, it is known for that infamous hospital scene. If you are watching this video, then it is highly likely that you already know what happens in the hospital room between Shinji and Asuka. If for some reason you are watching this and haven't seen the film yet or know about this scene in particular, let's just say that Shinji attempts to wake up an unconscious Asuka only to find himself unable to control his hormonal teenage impulses, leading him to release his pent-up feelings for her. This scene was a bold move, and I can see why this made a lot of people uncomfortable for the first time. Objectively, what we just witnessed was SA, and considering the ages of the parties involved, the entire scene is extremely off-putting and frankly disgusting. Shinji himself even says that right after it happens. However, because this is Evangelion, we know that this scene goes beyond simply being shocking for the sake of being shocking. What the hospital scene is trying to tell us is the fact that Shinji is so incapable of communicating that the only way he could think to try to reach her is by doing what he did. The decision he made in the hospital was born of a mixture of his own self-hatred, his love for Asuka, his unstable hormones, and his incredibly volatile mental state brought on by the losses he experienced in, well, the entire series. With this action, he was simultaneously trying to communicate his love for Asuka, trying to get her to wake up, trying to satisfy his own hormonal desires, and also trying to punish himself all at the same time. I don't want anyone getting it twisted. This scene is still objectively an illegal and immoral act, but it was important to show just how twisted Shinji's mental state was at the time and how it frames his already tumultuous relationship with Asuka. Later on in the film, we would get Asuka's perspective on this hospital scene. During the third impact, when everyone was bonded through human instrumentality, Asuka tells Shinji that she was fully aware of what he did to her in the hospital and implies that this wasn't the first time he's done something like this. In this same moment, she also dares him to do it again, while proclaiming that if she can't have Shinji all to herself, then she would rather not have him in her life at all. This further highlights their divide in communication. Asuka would have welcomed Shinji's advances had he been decisive enough to take that first step. However, instead of telling him this before the end of the world, she opted to bully and tease him for months. Meanwhile, Shinji desperately wanted to connect with Asuka, but instead chose inaction and violation. Once again, they are both trying to communicate their deep feelings for each other through incredibly fractured and toxic behaviors. These two showing their love for each other is like trying to squeeze a square block through a round hole. It'll just never work and end up being a very confusing mess. Their emotional baggage and personal insecurities made it impossible for them to have a proper conversation about their true feelings. This takes us to that iconic final scene on the beach at the end of Evangelion. Shinji and Asuka have both returned to existence. They are quite literally the only two people left on Earth. Shinji, now overwhelmed with every emotion possible, looks at the girl that he loves and cares about and wraps his hands around her neck. As always, this scene also has many layers to it, and there are many reasons why Shinji does this. His overwhelming emotions after everything that happened in the third impact are overlapping and destroying each other, and the only logical end result of that is the strongest emotion of all, which are hatred and violence. He could also have been trying to save Asuka from spending the rest of her life with someone as pathetic as he thinks he is. The beauty of this scene and of Evangelion as a whole is that there's not really one correct interpretation of it unless you are the creator Hideaki Anno himself. My personal favorite interpretation of the beach scene is that Shinji was desperately trying his hardest to communicate his feelings to Asuka, but was so consumed by his own self-loathing that it manifested as an act of violence. After all, what better way for someone who was raised on a diet of violence, hatred, and pain to think that the only way to communicate that affection is through more violence, hatred, and pain? And then Asuka decides to lift her hand and caress Shinji's cheek. This was the first true form of communication that Asuka has expressed in the entire series. She was showing vulnerability in its purest form. Asuka was able to take the risk and leave herself open to rejection by reaching out to Shinji, who in his own violent way was also trying to reach out to her. What we saw on the beach at the end of Evangelion was two mentally broken children trying their hardest to express their love for each other. The film ends with Asuka saying a single word, disgusting, which you can interpret as referring to Shinji, referring to herself, or the situation, or to the creator Hideaki Anno himself. So what did the relationship between Asuka and Shinji teach us? Well, for starters, don't get into relationships before resolving your own personal baggage. A romantic partner may be a great source of help and support to you if you're going through it, but that is all that they can be. A partner. They can't fix your traumas, nor is it their responsibility to do so. Both Shinji and Asuka validated an insecurity of the other. Shinji found comfort in Asuka and was obsessed with her because she would always belittle him and boss him around, which validated his self-loathing and need to please people. Asuka found comfort in Shinji because she sees him as the worthless and pathetic person that she fears becoming. In Shinji, Asuka would always find someone that she can be more superior than and never be vulnerable of being discarded by like her mother did to her. It can be comfortable to want someone who allows you to uphold your insecurities and self-hatred, but that comfort doesn't allow you to resolve your issues or to grow as a person. In order to develop and maintain a healthy and sustainable relationship, you have to work on yourself. You need to learn to understand and to love yourself. You need to resolve your issues without relying on your partner as a crutch or to be the solution to all of your problems. You need to essentially rebuild. The sequel film series, known commonly as Rebuild of Evangelion, acts as both a reboot and continuation of Shinji's story via a new timeline told through 4 movies. The first film follows pretty much the same plot as the original series, with some notable changes like how the water is now dyed a red color reminiscent of the beach scene at the end of Evangelion after the third impact. The biggest changes come in the second film with the introduction of Asuka, now named Asuka Shikinami Langely. Her new name is accompanied by a new character arc. Instead of hating dolls for representing her insecurities, Asuka Shikinami finds comfort in dolls. This new Asuka doesn't have the same schoolgirl crush and obsession with Mr. Kaji that the original Asuka had. She's also even capable of showing a degree of vulnerability. She's still very arrogant and has a massive god complex, but not to the level that we see in the original series. We see her sharing her feelings with the likes of Misato, Mari, and eventually even Shinji. Her feelings for Shinji remain intact, but she makes an effort this time to actually try to communicate that with him. In the second film, she even makes an effort to cook for Shinji, showing us that her deep-seated fear of rejection doesn't consume her like it did her previous incarnation. These very purposeful changes are there to indicate that Asuka's character in these rebuild films, as well as her relationship with Shinji, were headed in a very different direction. Meanwhile, let's see how Shinji Ikari has changed in the rebuild films. Yep, he's still miserable. It would not be Evangelion if Shinji wasn't suffering endlessly throughout it. The Shinji-Asuka dynamic still retains its shades of toxicity and communication issues throughout the second rebuild film. Asuka still belittles Shinji to mask her affections for him, and Shinji is still indecisive in everything. The Ninth Angel incident happens to Asuka in this film rather than to Toji like it did in the original series. Shinji's indecisiveness leads to his father Gendo overriding the controls of Unit 1 and forcing him to nearly end Asuka. This leads to a scene of Shinji in Unit 1 holding up Asuka in Unit 3 by the neck, resembling the scene of Shinji doing the same thing to her in the original series. In both instances, the conflict occurred because of Shinji's indecisiveness, which was a major source of conflict and miscommunication between the pair. The biggest changes that the rebuild films make from the original series is in the third and fourth film. After Shinji almost ends the world again with the near third impact, 14 whole years pass with Shinji being lost inside Eva Unit 1. Meanwhile, everyone around him has moved on and adapted to the new world. An extremely crucial component of this time skip is that the Eva pilots themselves did not age at all in those 14 years. This was a brilliant way to showcase the mental stagnation that Shinji experiences as he refuses to grow up and deal with his own issues. Shinji's mental state stands in contrast to Asuka, who despite her physical age remaining the same, has spent 14 years growing up, learning to understand herself and maturing as a person. The insecurities that plagued her previous incarnation seem to have been replaced with steadfast confidence and righteous determination. She isn't pathologically obsessed with being the best anymore and thus doesn't need to lean on Shinji as a crutch to validate that insecurity. She even finds comfort in Kensuke, a partner that she doesn't treat as inferior to her but accepts as an equal. It's vague whether or not Kensuke and Asuka were romantically involved, but it was significant that she ended up back at his place at the end of the final film. In that final film, Shinji falls into his worst depressive state ever after losing Kaworu. His near catatonic state puts everyone off around him, including the survivors in the small town who took them in. Little did Shinji know, this extended period of suffering was something that needed to happen for him to be able to grow as a person. He was no longer pleasing people, no longer following orders to placate others, no longer seeking external validation by being somebody's doormat. Granted, he didn't really seek anything at that point, other than just being alone in his misery, just waiting to rot. He was choosing to self-isolate because that is what he wanted to do. Even if it was self-destructive, it was the beginning of Shinji making his own decisions. Thanks to the combined efforts of the villagers, Asuka, and the clone of Rei, Shinji regains his motivation and they all gear up to stop Gendo. Well, not Rei, cause you know, the whole that thing. Before their final mission began, Shinji displays some more growth by actively apologizing to Asuka for not taking action 14 years ago during the Ninth Angel incident. This was a major sign of maturity because Shinji actively recognizes what his problem was and directly apologized for it. There was no internal panic, no violence, no childish need for validation. It was just a person admitting their faults to the person that they hurt. Asuka recognizes this and rewards his growth with some validation that she did have a crush on him when they were children. This was an amazing display of growth from Asuka as well, because here she is directly admitting her feelings and opening herself up to vulnerability, which was something that the previous Asuka was so scared to do that it basically destroyed her. Asuka then simply said that she grew up first, which is why she no longer has those feelings anymore. This short and simple exchange of dialogue demonstrated just how far these two have grown as people thanks to their time apart from each other. The film ends with Shinji facing the biggest source of his insecurity and self-hatred, his father, Gendo Ikari. It was a shock to him to find out that Gendo was also just another loser just like him who tried blocking out the world until he met his mother Yui. After defeating his father, Shinji has finally fully accepted that he has the power to make his own decisions in life. The indecisive, pathetic, self-hating child who couldn't get into the robot unless somebody forced him to has now become a self-assured man ready to choose his own destiny. It was only when Shinji fully matured that he ended up back on that same beach at the end of Evangelion with Asuka. This time, he was able to properly communicate with her. There were no barriers of insecurities, no AT fields blocking what he truly wanted to say, just open and honest communication. Shinji thanked Asuka for telling him that she liked him and shared that he also liked her back then. These were the simple words that he couldn't properly say to her at the end of Evangelion. Back then, getting out a simple phrase like "I like you" was so difficult and complicated for an emotionally disturbed Shinji that it came out as an act of violence. After his self-actualization, it became as easy as saying 2 sentences. It's also important to note that they both have their adult bodies at this point to properly match their mental and emotional growth. They have both outgrown their naive childhood crushes and codependent need for external validation. They have both outgrown each other. As much as we idealize the first time we fall in love, most of that time, that love is a learning experience. Shinji and Asuka had too much personal baggage to properly communicate and properly love each other in the original series. They wanted the other to fill the void created by their own personal insecurities. When the two of them grew up in the rebuild films, they found that they didn't need each other anymore. They both moved on from their past and from their pain, and they were both ready to live their own lives separate of each other. Asuka and Shinji's story throughout all of Evangelion shows us that mental and emotional turmoil can deteriorate communication and turn something as pleasant as childhood love into something painful and violent. They show us that falling in love with others before learning to love yourself can hurt more than it helps. This is why Shinji doesn't end up with Asuka but instead finds Mari. Asuka represented Shinji's past, his codependent nature, his mental instability, and the toxic ways that he viewed the world and himself. Their entire relationship in the original series was an unhealthy dynamic that regressed the both of them as people. Mari, on the other hand, was a completely new character introduced in the rebuild films. Her nature is optimistic, friendly, and lighthearted. She may possibly be the only positive person in the entirety of Evangelion before the ending. Her interactions with Shinji were tinged with a joy and playfulness that he doesn't have with anybody else in the series. It was only when Shinji grew up that he ended up with her because Mari represented change, a new direction, and the limitless possibilities of the future now that Shinji has achieved self-confidence and emotional maturity. This is why Mari takes the collar off of his neck in the last scene on the train station. She was the last piece of the puzzle to free him from his incredibly toxic past so that they can all move forward into the future. Wherever Shinji ends up after they leave the train station, I am sure it won't be free from suffering. But we know now that Shinji is strong enough to endure that pain without losing his sense of self ever again. But this is where you come in. What do you think about Asuka and Shinji's relationship? What are your thoughts on Evangelion as a whole? Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll catch you next time with some more lukewarm takes.